Irfan was directly involved with the war in Bosnia and Herzegovina from 1992 to 1994. He was a strategic advisor to the UN Protection Forces and worked with the World Health Organization, to assist delivery of medical and humanitarian supplies. He later served as a policy advisor to the UN High Commissioner for Refugees in Croatia. In Bosnia, he negotiated many ceasefires on the front lines and supervised the release of prisoners, most notably from the Gabela concentration camp in Herzegovina. Irfan has remained involved with Bosnia ever since. He has served on the Advisory Council for Bosnia and Herzegovina in Washington, D.C., and continues as the founding member of the Voices of the Bosnian Genocide in Seattle. Irfan is married to a Bosnian native and is proficient in Bosnian, Serbo-Croatian language. We're delighted to welcome you. Would you give a warm welcome?
Thank you so much. Pleasure. Thank you. Thank you for welcoming me. Well, good afternoon, everyone. Can everybody hear me okay?
Yes, sir.
Okay, great. Well, what a wonderful welcome. Thank you so much. Every time I come to Sonoma State, I'm amazed at the program, at the curriculum. Dr. Goodman, Dr. Parnas, the faculty, the Alliance, Barbara McCaffrey, everybody that sort of put this program together. It's probably the premier Holocaust and Genocide studies program in the country. And it's an honor, absolute honor for me to be here and speak to you. The place to start is this all happened by some historical context not so long ago, by perhaps another historical context a long, long time ago, perhaps probably before many of you were born. But the lessons from it are important. And one of the things that this program and the Alliance do is to make the lessons relevant. They have currency. And by that, what I mean is that those lessons apply today. There are things that we can look at, patterns, trends, how the war started, how war turned into genocide, and try to understand that in the context of our society today, because that makes it so much more relevant. So you're probably asking, why this guy? Why Irfan? Why here? Why am I an interesting person to talk about Bosnia and Herzegovina? Right? So this is me, 1992. At the start of the war, I was a young college graduate running a small business in Beverly Hills, and I decided to go and help. The war started, and it was for me a test of my humanity. Perhaps it was the thing that I wanted to go and do. And since then, I've been involved in Bosnia and Herzegovina. I've been active with the Bosnian diaspora, the local community here, as well as active in Bosnia itself. In fact, let me just grab something. So I have some context. I think the point I'm trying to make is that I've seen a lot of it firsthand. And then the second thing I think that makes me sort of an interesting person is I wrote this book called The History of Bosnia and Herzegovina. And it's yet another book. You can find it. It's yet another book, but it is also a different perspective. It's a perspective that sort of stretches back in time, well before most of the sort of historical context that covers Bosnia today. And so that made it somewhat more interesting. And then the third thing I think that happened to me was last year there was a journalist who came from Bosnia and Herzegovina to the United States. He's a very popular television journalist in Bosnia. His name is Senad Hadjifezovic. And he came to interview me. This was quite a big thing. It's the most popular television program in Bosnia. Everybody watches it. And I did a 10, 15-minute interview with him. And of course, everybody watched it. So that summer when I went to Bosnia last year, I became sort of an instant celebrity. And people would come up to me in the street. They'd offer me coffee and buy me food and things. And to cap it all off, at the end of the year, the television network had a contest of some kind. And in that contest, they voted for sort of the most popular people, or what do they call them? The personalities of the year. I came in number 16 in the country. I was shocked. I almost fell on the floor. So there's some context. And I guess the journalist, when I met with him in the summer in Bosnia, he said, look, now people will really listen to you because you're a celebrity. So I guess maybe that's what it takes to go from somebody who was trying to do good to achieving some level of perhaps notoriety. But to be really serious, this was my first day in Sarajevo. They had set up blockades. So we're going back to April of 1992. It's about this time of the year, as a matter of fact. It's probably middle of April, around the 14th or 15th of April. I ended up renting a car in Vienna at Hertz rental car place, and I just drove right into the war. I was going to go do good. I was going to try to help people if I possibly could. Wasn't a smart thing to do, by the way. Don't recommend any of you to do it at this time. It was a different time, a different era, perhaps a different set of risks that I was tolerant to that most of your parents wouldn't be tolerant to today. But this is what I saw. And I zigzagged my way through these barricades, not realizing that they've actually placed landmines on the road. And somehow I survived. Trip after trip after trip. I would load the car up. It was a Volkswagen Golf. I'd load it up with medical supplies, medicines, antibiotics, anything I could get my hands on, and I'd just drive into town and deliver them. And I'd drive back out. They'd give me lists. Right? It became sort of an enterprise. I mean, I ended up just driving supplies back and forth. When my kids ask me about, or tell people about what their dad did during the war, my son at one point said, I think my dad was a truck driver there. I drove convoys. Yeah, I led convoys into the cities, crossing front lines. So I have some context. I want to tell you a little story about something that happened to me around May. This is known as Maja od Bosna. It means the Dragon of Bosnia. It's the main street that runs through Sarajevo. And this is a very important entry point to Sarajevo. Sarajevo is sort of a city that sits in a valley, hills on one side, hills on the other side, this main boulevard sort of going through the center of town. At some point in time, I found myself a little bit past this block. You see these, what are these little barricades here, these metallic barricades. Somewhere past here, there were snipers up in these apartments. And this street actually became known as Sniper Alley because so many journalists were killed and attacked on this one. I found myself on this street in probably in the summer of 1992. And a sniper started shooting at me. And I was walking at the time. I didn't have a car. I'd just come out of the airport. And the United Nations were running flights, cargo flights and things like that into the airport. And I got a ride partway into town with one of the UN soldiers. And then I decided to walk the rest of the way. He was too afraid to go in because there was too much sniping and shelling. And in the middle of this road, and you can see how wide that road is. It's probably, 60, 70 meters wide, maybe even more than that. I found myself being sniped at. Pop, 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 nonstop. And I didn't quite know what to do. I'm looking around. I'm not sure where the gunfire is coming from. I found a garbage can, one of those old zinc corrugated aluminum something garbage cans, and I went and hid behind it. And there I was for about 20 minutes under sniper fire, hugging this stinky old garbage can because that was the only thing that was going to save my life. Right? And at that point in time, I thought to myself, what's my purpose? What am I doing here? How did I actually end up in the middle of this mess? Right? And then somebody came from around the other side, and he was calling me, "Hello, hello!" And I'm looking around, and I see a guy. He's got a Kalashnikov something, but he's not shooting at me. So I'm like, okay, so this is good. He's calling me. I think he's like, trying to help me probably. And then he gives me some signals, and he does this, like this, 3, 2, 1 kind of thing. And then he's like pointing with his Kalashnikov, and I got the message. He's going to lay down some diversionary fire, and then he's expecting me to run across this boulevard while he, shoots at the sniper, and then the sniper either shoots back at him or me. I'm sitting there having to make a decision. Like, I don't know how this is ever going to work out. Right now, do I go or do I stay? How long will this garbage can sustain me? Right? So these are sort of like very difficult choices you have. But in that moment of adversity, trying to understand what my purpose was became very important for me because it's the thing that helped me survive that ordeal. And my purpose was really simple. It was to understand what was going on there. Understand how a civil society like ex-Yugoslavia, Yes, it was militarized, but the average people weren't. How did that society become this situation where a foreign worker who's coming in to bring medicines or whatever is now having to hug a garbage can to save his life? Right? So that understanding sort of became a driving purpose for me, and I'm going to today share with you what I think I've uncovered in that understanding. Okay? And we'll keep this a relatively interactive session, so if you have questions, please feel free to ask them for clarification, and at the end I'll make sure I give plenty of time to have a discussion with you, because the most important thing I want each of us to take away today is, why is this relevant? Why is it important? We know it happened. Okay, we kind of have the knowledge of it all. So when you start thinking about genocide, right, the Bosnian genocide had two goals. First goal was to destroy the sovereignty of the nation of Bosnia and Herzegovina. On March 1st, 1992, Bosnia had declared independence from Yugoslavia. Prior to that, other nations like Croatia, Slovenia had also declared independence. All three nations ended up in war with Yugoslavia. A guy by the name of Slobodan Milosevic, who was running the place at the time, decided to send the Yugoslav People's Army, or the National Army, to try to stop these countries from seceding, or these republics from seceding. Right? The second goal was this word that we use called extirpation. It's basically trying to force the extermination, the elimination of an ethnic group. And in the case of Bosnia, it was this ethnic group of people that today we're calling Bosniaks. And we'll get into sort of talking about what that group looks like and what all the ethnicities look like. Right? So this now becomes a very classical case, if you start thinking in terms of genocide, classical case of a population being targeted. Right? And in case after case in the International Criminal Tribunal in The Hague, judges and the judiciary had ruled that there was deliberate attempt to either ethnically cleanse, by that we mean forcefully displace a population, or to murder them, or to rape them, to prevent births, and so on. So it starts fitting into this classical definition of genocide when you start looking at the facts of what happened. Okay? It was widely televised. I mean, me sitting in Beverly Hills, all of a sudden hearing about this thing called Bosnia and Herzegovina in 1992 means that news made it fast. Right? We saw journalists like Christian Amanpour in Sarajevo, and Peter Jennings was there, and ITN, the television network from Britain, and the BBC, and I mean everybody was there, and they were covering this war like it was some sort of a sporting event. Right? And it was broadcast into our televisions. We sat in America and Canada and Australia and all over the world, in Germany and Austria, and we watched these images coming of snipers and shelling and bombing and people trying to escape and all of that. Daily news reports. John Burns sitting at the Holiday Inn in Sarajevo, sending dispatches to the New York Times. Roy Gutman sending to New York Newsday and the Washington Post what he was seeing on a daily basis. It wasn't that we didn't have knowledge of what was going on. We absolutely knew on a daily basis what was happening. So we had knowledge. It was televised. I believe it could have been prevented. And the outcome of the whole thing at the end was that we were forced, as humanity, as a society, to revive the international criminal justice system. Right? From the time of Nuremberg and Tokyo, this system had sort of not really been used for anything. And Bosnia and Rwanda, of course, are the two that sort of sparked this entire sort of new, innovative way of thinking about criminal justice. Right? 50 years after the Holocaust, when we said it'll never happen again, it happened again. We thought that what was lacking was the commitment to prevent. And I believe that that continues to be the case today, that should there be a genocide, and there are places where we see this going on today, things that are either genocide or very close to genocide, I don't see that there's any sort of an international will to prevent it. Now, we've even stopped covering it because it's no longer television currency. to show pictures of children being killed, videos, and so on. Nothing is that interesting anymore, right? So Bosnia perhaps had an advantage, if you want to say it that way, in that it was valuable to sort of see that war unfold. And I don't know that I was necessarily all that different, because I went there not to perhaps see, but to see if I could make a difference, right? And so you start seeing that there's this international engagement, but the engagement is really about learning, it's about reporting, it's about sort of, seeing what people are doing. There's really never a call to action. And in Bosnia, the entire time that I was there from the beginning of the war in 1992 till 1994, about a year before the end of the war. And I didn't see any compelling call to action. I didn't see anybody standing up and saying, hey, we're going to go do things. There were a lot of diplomatic efforts. Countries had put forth a fair amount of diplomacy in the region, but the diplomacy was always around serving sort of special interests and achieving perhaps a level of balance that people could tolerate, not necessarily having the objective of saying we're going to go and end a crisis situation. And could it have been prevented? I don't know, the jury's still out. These are questions I think that each of you will be asked at some point in time. And I'm hoping that some of you who choose to go into sort of graduate studies or post-grad studies will actually go and look at the events and the actions and activities and the behaviors and try to understand if there is a way to have prevented some of these things. Okay. I want to talk a little bit about the ICTY. Just recently, a couple of weeks ago, about 3 weeks ago, one of the head criminals, a guy by the name of Radovan Karadžić's appeal was adjudicated in the International Criminal Tribunal in The Hague. And the court extended his sentence from 45 years to life imprisonment and reaffirmed that even that was insufficient. And it was for the act of genocide that he inspired, that he led, that he had his hands in, and that he had orchestrated. The other guy, Milosevic, died while he was in trial in The Hague, so we don't really have an outcome of that. Why does Bosnia matter today, and why does it matter to America? I think this is a very important thing. America is probably Bosnia's best ally today. I can safely say that because I'm active here in the US in making sure that America remains a very strong ally of Bosnia. But America also needs Bosnia. Bosnia is one of those former Yugoslavian communist countries. It sort of sits in the Balkans in such a vicarious geographical location. It's about 960 kilometers from, 960 miles from Brussels. And it is a very, very important strategic asset for the United States to have, because it is one of the buffer zones between the great Russian power and what we call sort of Central and Western Europe, Eastern Europe, right? So there's an opportunity to make sure that the values that we have of equality and liberty, democracy, the principles that we value of free markets, that these sustain in this buffer zone, so that the totalitarian or authoritarian forces or market tendencies that tend to come from those centralized economies don't sort of encroach on our freedoms. And it's an area of emerging scholarship. There's so much documentation. The Radovan Karadžić's trial alone, by the way, generated 2,500 pages of decision alone. Judge Kwan's decision, and actually the judiciary's decision, was 2,500 pages. Imagine that. The judges have to sit there and write a 2,500-page explanation for why they found somebody guilty of this horrendous crime, right? And it took years, dozens of years, to try all of these criminals, and all of the testimonies sitting there. So it's a rich, amazing data source, if you want to call it that, of information to go study and to go explore. Okay, I think I covered that. I wanted to share a story with you about this place. This is the town of Prijedor in northwestern Bosnia and Herzegovina. Coming up in about 6 weeks is the 27th anniversary of an event that took place in Prijedor. This is a town of about 100,000 people. An event that took place. The town was blockaded very early in the war, and all the Muslims in the town were forced to wear white armbands on May 31st, 1992. White armbands. If they were caught in the street without the white armbands, they could be shot by anybody, a civilian who was not a Muslim, or a policeman, or a civil worker, or the military. They had to hang white flags from their windows to designate their homes as Muslim homes. Right? So it was a very targeted campaign. This is Prijedor in the northwestern area of Bosnia. And these are the white armbands that people had to wear. Who would think in 1992 that we would have such an event, that something like this would be required? Imagine if today, I don't know, take your pick, left-handed people in Petaluma and Santa Rosa were required to sort of identify themselves as left-handed somehow. Imagine if you were being persecuted or being identified, isolated, targeted. Right? And it wasn't that people were just required to sort of self-report. This is a book called Raw Memory, and it's about the war in Prijedor. And in it, there's a very important piece of text. The author is writing about some people that he knew that were sort of captured very early, even before the war started. And one of them is this woman named Velida Mahmuljin. You'll see her name up here. She's a teacher and a member of the Social Democratic Action Party. And this woman was arrested very early, and she disappeared. And nobody ever knows what became of her. And you think, well, weren't there a lot of people that were lost in the war and so on? Yeah, there were. Except it so happens that her son, at age 14, was a refugee in the United States. His name is Vedad Mahmuljin, and he, 2 years in a row now, has been Boeing's Engineer of the Year. So if you're ever flying on a 787 Dreamliner, he's one of the aeronautical engineers who's put it together. He raised himself from age 14 without parents. Came as a refugee to the US, he and his sister. And somehow they managed and they survived. So very relevant, very current relationship to what was happening in the war. Right? And he's a very successful engineer. He's a smart young man. He lives in Seattle. I know him really well. He's a good friend of mine. But he doesn't know much about his mother. He doesn't know much about his father. He was only 14. He kind of remembers them, of course, but doesn't know what happened. And I don't think they found the remains yet. Right? So, and they're also from the northwestern part of Bosnia, close to the town of Prijedor. Right? So, very relevant stories that have continued or sustained over a period of time with me. And when I meet these people, of course, I know a lot of their stories from back home. Maybe I don't know the families, but I certainly know what happened in their towns because I visited so many of them. So concentration camps were set up in northwestern Bosnia. They became famous names, you know, kind of like you know probably about Auschwitz and Jasenovac from the Second World War. There are comparable equivalents coming back from the 1990s. Omarska, Keratem. Dr. Goodman talked about Gabela, a camp that I had visited, and I was able to sort of fortunate maybe to negotiate the release of some prisoners who were being held there. They were actually children. They were about, I don't know, somewhere between 13 and 19-year-old boys that had been captured. And the mother of one of the 13-year-olds came to me in a refugee camp, and she said, well, they've arrested my son. I said, well, what did he do? She said, I don't know. He didn't do anything, but they took a whole bunch of boys, and they had official refugee status in Croatia, but the military in Croatia would come and they'd arrest these boys, and they would take them back into Bosnia, and they would actually exchange them as prisoners of war. So what was happening was the International Committee of the Red Cross would exchange prisoners of war, and they were about to go and exchange this group of refugees for prisoners that had been captured during some battle scenes. And so when I found out about it, I went to the Red Cross and I said, look, these are not combatants. These are civilians that have been rounded up and now they're being exchanged. And the local heads of the Red Cross said to me, well, what do you care? They're going to be exchanged and they'll be returned to their sites. And I said, no, this is not a fair exchange. This is not how it's supposed to work. This does not follow the Convention of Prisoner Exchange according to Geneva. Right? So there was this I want to say, sort of a bureaucratic mechanism that the international community carries with it that had been placed, and that bureaucratic mechanism just sort of added more complexity to the situation that wasn't needed. So I go back now to my garbage can that I'm hugging, and I'm 20 minutes under sniper fire thinking about what is it that I'm supposed to be doing here. And that's what it was. It was to disambiguate, to be able to clarify what was happening during that war and how a foreign presence, the international community, had actually complicated things more to the point that they could no longer be explained. Right? And this is one of the things that you find as you sit through lecture after lecture from survivors of the genocide. It's a pretty clear thing of what happened to them. Right? They were a small child, 7 years old. My family was evicted from its home. We ended up taking refuge here and here. Our neighbors came, they took our property, they threatened us, they did this, they did that. They were friends with my dad before. I mean, the stories continue like that. Right? But the patterns, what I'm trying to get at, are relatively the same. So to give you some clear background on what happened and to provide clarity into this whole thing, I'll start with this guy by the name of Slobodan Milosevic. Milosevic came to power in former Yugoslavia. He was a very authoritarian type of dictator-style leader. He was a staunch communist, certainly not a fan of one of his earlier predecessors, Josip Broz Tito, who was sort of the founder of the modern Yugoslavia. Milosevic had his own way of rallying the people. He was an amazing propagandist. I hate to say anything positive about the guy because he was such a scumbag, but here's the thing. He absolutely knew how to rally the masses. He could get them behind him. Right? And he would speak, and tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of people would show up at his rallies, and they would be cheering him on, you know, and he would be talking about hatred, and they would be cheering him on. Gee, it makes me wonder, do we ever see that today in our society? Right? And if we do, we should be absolutely afraid of it. We should be scared to death that that's happening. If it's happening anywhere here, anywhere in the civilized world, if it's happening anywhere where people are living, we need to be afraid that that is going to result in some catastrophic outcome. Because that's what happened. There was no Bosnian, I want to say, in 1990, I mean, maybe there were a few, but certainly the masses did not believe that in 2 years their country was going to go to war. There just was no belief. And if there was going to be some sort of a military action, it was just going to be martial law, police action, curfew, these kinds of things, right? Nobody ever believed it would end up in genocide or 100,000 people dead or so on, right? Milosevic built his campaign around a 19th century document that had been written by the deputy minister of Serbia, a man by the name of Ilija Garašanin. Garašanin wrote this thing called Nacrtanje. It's like a blueprint or a draft of some kind. And in that blueprint, he did some really, really interesting things that you're going to find quite appalling. And I'll tell you the first one that he did. He identified this notion of a greater Serbia. Right, to say that the Serbian people, in order to survive, needed to have this, like, you know, access to the sea, a greater level of autonomy and control and territory. And he proposed doing that by annexing Croatia and Bosnia-Herzegovina and Kosovo. This was in the 19th century. This was his reaction to Austro-Hungarian rule in the Balkans. That, hey, we need to expand our nation so that we can sustain. Right? So it was sort of a defensive kind of a document, but it was quite belligerent, because in it, he also said that the Bosnians and the Croatians are deviants. They're actually Serbs who've converted either to Catholicism or to Islam. He said they were variants of Serbs. He immediately started denying their identity. He started denying their ethnic makeup. And he said they're devoid of national conscience. Means that they don't know what a state is, therefore they shouldn't be a state. They should never be allowed to have a state. They shouldn't be allowed the basic rights that are associated with a nation. Right? These are quite damning words. And Milosevic, of course, built on this. And this great hero from the early Serbian history of the 19th century who led the sort of rebellion against the Austro-Hungarians and the oppressive rule of the Habsburg dynasty. And he built on that theme. Today, in America, we find anti-ethnic, anti-populist population rhetoric. Right? We want to go build a wall because of some sort of an ethnic thing that's happening, or some level of migration that's going on. We really need to think about the common sense and the parallels that has back to this. Right? We want to start identifying people in our nation as one thing or another. I think these are all very, very dangerous trends, and they certainly map back to this notion of whatever was going on over in that time. And then, to give you some background on Bosnia, the Ottomans came to Bosnia-Herzegovina in 1462. By 1468, Sultan Mehmed Fatih, the Ottoman emperor, had conquered Bosnia-Herzegovina and began a policy of investment. And the Bosnian church at the time was probably among the first Protestant churches in Europe. And that church was known as Bogomil. They had been cast out as heretics by the Catholics, by the Vatican, and they were not considered part of the Orthodoxy. Right? So 300 years after Christianity split into Orthodoxy and Catholicism, this sect of Christians in Bosnia-Herzegovina, known as Bogomils, found themselves actually without having an ecclesiastical hierarchy. It means that they didn't have any place to sort of call their the head of their church. And when the Ottomans came, they offered them a place where the church could receive protection by the state. And so naturally, massively, those Protestant Christians converted to Islam. So Bosnia ended up having a population that was sort of mixed of perhaps probably about 50% Muslims, about 30 to 35% Orthodox, and another 15% or so Catholics. And among all of them are other types of ethnic groups, such as Romas. Jews came to Bosnia-Herzegovina in the time of the Spanish Inquisition, when they were kicked out by Queen Isabella and King Ferdinand from Spain and Portugal. The Ottomans offered them a place to stay and to call their home. Many went to Salonika, from Salonika to Rhodes. Many went from there to Bosnia-Herzegovina, and they integrated into Bosnian society. And over a period of time, names like Cohen, which were Sephardic Jewish names, became Coffin, right? And Eva became Hava. And so they integrated into Bosnian society. Before the Second World War, there were more synagogues in Sarajevo than there were any place else on the planet. Any place else on the planet, right? After the Second World War, there were none. Right? They were destroyed. There's a very famous story about the Sarajevo Haggadah. This is a book that came from the Sephardic Jews in Spain. It dates back to about the 14th century. And the book, the Haggadah, is a book that's used at the time of the Passover. And the father reads it to the son, and they tell the story. Families sort of carried this tradition on. And somebody sold this book in Sarajevo, that one of the Jewish families that had brought it. And it ended up in the museum. And in the Second World War, Hitler had set up sort of a campaign to cleanse Europe of all the Jews that were there. And as part of that campaign, he tried to collect artifacts that were valuable. They burned Torahs and destroyed sort of Jewish artifacts and any sign of Jewry. But one of the things that he did is he sent a man by the name of Colonel Fortner to Sarajevo to pick up this book called the Sarajevo Haggadah. He wanted to have Sarajevo and Belgrade become cities that were Judenfrei, is what they called it, means free of Jews. And so when Colonel Fortner came to Sarajevo to pick up this book, the rector of the museum, the deputy director of the museum, was a man by the name of Dervish Korkut. Dervish took the book and he sort of stuffed it. It's a smaller book. It's about half the size of this. He stuffed it in the nape of his pants, and then he buttoned up his three-piece suit. And he came to meet Colonel Fortner. said, how may I help you? And Colonel Fortner said, I'm here to get the Sarajevo Haggadah. I understand that your museum has it. And he said, I'm so sorry, but I have given the book to a Nazi officer, a German officer, who had come yesterday to pick it up, telling a lie. And Colonel Fortner asked him, what was his name? He said, I dare not ask the name of an officer of the Third Reich, right? And so, and then he got in his car, the Korkut, and he drove to a town, a little village outside of Sarajevo called Trebević, and he took the Haggadah out and he gave it to an imam, a head of a mosque there, and asked him to go hide it. And the imam put it in with the Qurans in the mosque, and it stayed there until the end of the Second World War. Today, it is probably Sarajevo or Bosnia's most celebrated artifact because it is this precious, valuable, how do you say, collectible from the time of the Jewish migration to Bosnia and Herzegovina. So the Ottomans did a tremendous thing in Bosnia by investing in it, by allowing freedom of religion, by allowing extending the state of the protection of the state to ethnic minorities. And then the Austro-Hungarians, with the Treaty of Berlin, divided up sort of Ottoman lands. The Ottoman Empire was crumbling. It had gone into debt because of the wars it had extended against the Hungarians, against the Russians. The Russo-Turkic wars cost them dearly, and they annexed Bosnia and Herzegovina along with it. Of course, not being a place where rulers are left alone, the First World War started in Sarajevo. This bridge was actually known as the Princip Most. It's named after this guy, Gavrilo Princip, who assassinated this guy, the Archduke Franz Ferdinand, and his wife, Duchess Sophie. Franz Ferdinand was the heir apparent to the Habsburg throne and was going to secede to rule the Austro-Hungarian Empire. But with the assassination, it brought the wrath of the Austro-Hungarians on against Serbia. Princip was actually hired by an organization in Belgrade in Serbia known as the Secret Black Hand Society, who had sort of modeled themselves after in the form of a terrorist organization. This bridge in Sarajevo during communist times was known as Princip Most, but since then it's been renamed and it's now called the Latin Bridge for no reason other than the fact that it's a more tolerable name. But there's a tradition in all of this and a pattern that's really important to understand. And the pattern is that war criminals and terrorists like Princip were actually glorified. Right? And that's a very important thing to stop and to go look at and to say, you know, there's this revival of international criminal justice is a very important step in Bosnia and Herzegovina and in Rwanda and in other places because it at least gives us the first barrier to stopping the glorification of criminals. Right? Certainly those who committed atrocities against humanity, war crimes, mass atrocities, those are at least being labeled in some international forum as being criminals. Right? So there's some patterns that we can start to think about. Fast forward a little bit past the First World War, as Germany's coming out, the Weimar Republic is paying its debt, the Turks are paying their debt. What's happening? The Kingdom of Yugoslavia is being formed by the Karađorđević family, and you will see King Paul here, Paul Alexander, sitting with notorious Adolf Hitler. He spent a week and some days with Hitler. They agreed to having a cooperation between Yugoslavia, the Kingdom of Yugoslavia, and the Nazis. And now history gets incredibly complicated because King Paul is overthrown only a few days after he comes back to Belgrade, and a new dynasty is started, but the dynasty signs a tripartite agreement which allows the Nazis to travel through Yugoslavia. This is how Greece was attacked, and of course Belgrade is declared as the very first city during the Second World War to be free of Jews. Absolutely free. And King Peter takes over, And of course, by 1941, Yugoslavia was conquered. A lot of the war and the blood of the Second World War happened in Bosnia and Herzegovina, and as it did in Serbia. The government of Milan Nedic takes over sort of this notion of national salvation of Serbia, and the state of Croatia becomes a puppet of the Nazi regime. And some of the people that I met in Sarajevo, and when I talked to them, spent extensive periods of time with them, a particular Jewish family that I got to know so well. I stayed in their house and so on. They would tell me that the Croats at the time were trying to be better Nazis than the Nazis themselves. This is the first time I'd heard any sort of a concept like that, to try to be more Nazi than a Nazi. Right? But they had something to prove, and they proved it, because 300,000 Serbs were killed during that Croatian puppet state known as the Independent State of Hrvatska, NDH. In Yugoslavia, two movements started. The movement led by Draže Mihailović, and a movement started by a man by the name of Josip Broz Tito. Tito's team people were called the Partisans, and Mihailovic's people were called the Chetniks. They were both sort of liberation movements, but the Chetniks ended up wallowing sort of in the war. They took sides with whoever was appearing to win, rather than stand to defend their territory. Tito, on the other hand, stood steadfast. He started protecting as much territory as he could, and Tito began his movement in the small town in central Bosnia known as Jajce. And in that town, he brought together some of the leaders, formed this notion of having anti-fascist movement, and that movement grew. Tito started with virtually nothing in his pocket, and by the end of the Second World War, he had pulled together 6 republics and 2 autonomous provinces in the form of the communist state of Yugoslavia. And he branded it and created his own sort of version of a multi-ethnic pan-nationalist state with a type of a brand of communism that I think we call today Titoism. But the result of the Second World War was catastrophic in Yugoslavia. 300,000 people dead, 85,000 Jews and Serbs killed, 13,000 Jews in one concentration camp of Jasenovac alone were killed. And anybody who tried to help them, the gypsy population of Bosnia and Herzegovina was practically eradicated because they were not welcome. They were identified as being different. They had darker skin. They spoke a different language. Their culture was different. Their loyalty to one religious faith or another was not well established. They were not an understood people, and they were denigrated, treated as second-class, maybe even third-class citizens, certainly not worthy of being given the right to even live. So Second World War, we saw a really bloody activity in Yugoslavia, and in particular in Bosnia and Herzegovina. And then after that, it became sort of an industrial state, and we didn't really hear anything about Yugoslavia on the international scene until 1984. And in 1984, Sarajevo had the glory of hosting the Winter Olympics. So this now puts Sarajevo at the same, I don't know, Calgary. Weren't the Winter Olympics there? Lillehammer, right, in Norway, Lake Placid, New York, Salt Lake City, right, Vancouver, British Columbia, all of a sudden, Whistler, right, all of a sudden, Sarajevo is the center spotlight. And I remember this as a kid. I watched these Olympics. I remember Jim Nance on ABC News Sports broadcasting, and I remember all of these people. This is Katarina Witt from East Germany, and she took gold medal in figure skating. Phil and Steve Maher, I don't know which one is which, they're twins, from Yakima, Washington, winning like downhill and slalom, and Scott Hamilton from America taking the gold medal. It was a fascinating Olympics. And there was this guy by the name of Jure Franco from Yugoslavia. He got the only medal that Yugoslavia got in those Winter Olympics. He took silver, I think, in skiing. There was an interview that was done at the time of the Winter Olympics in Lillehammer by Sports Illustrated. And they asked Jure, you know, sort of like somebody who's coming out of an Olympic career, what he remembered 10 years after the war in Yugoslavia. And he said, look, when I won the silver medal, people jumped on me of all ethnicities. They hugged me, they kissed me, they loved me. It's a beautiful article, you can read it in Sports Illustrated. He said, I thought I was in heaven, and that this place, he's talking about now Yugoslavia, was what heaven was meant to be. Okay? And he says, I felt so loved. And 10 years later, right, the place is torn to shambles. What caused that? Imagine Salt Lake City 10 years from the time of its Olympics, that we're sitting there and we're saying, what happened? What happened in Lake Placid, New York? What happened in any place? Right? It was a complete shock, even to the people who lived there, even to the people who were there. And then, 1992, war started. Right? Iconic towers in Sarajevo, shelled. These are office buildings. There's really nothing going on over there. It's just office buildings. And somebody decided to launch this menacing weapon called an incendiary grenade. It hits, it's like they lob it from like hundreds of meters away. And then the thing lands someplace. And when it lands, not only does it explode, but it causes this intense fire. This intense fire that could cause, this is a 24-story building, that could cause buildings to collapse. Right? And it burns everything. I don't know who invented this thing, but it's absolutely, absolutely crime against humanity to even have such a thing, and then for somebody to use it, and to use it in a population, a city with a population of 360,000 people. Sarajevo was under blockade from 1992 to 1994 for 1,424 days. That's longer than the siege of Stalingrad. It is the longest siege of any city in modern warfare. Right? And there was a purpose to that siege. The purpose was to eliminate the population. That's all there was to it. They couldn't kill 360,000 people all at the same time, but they sure tried to starve them to death. They cut off the water supply to the city. They cut off electricity and gas. Anything that they could possibly do. My convoys, I don't know, I lost track of how many times we were attacked, how many times we were threatened, how many times we were we had our goods stolen from us. I lost track. I actually just stopped writing the manifest. I used to send back dispatches to my dad almost on a weekly basis from there, thinking if something happened to me, at least my dad will sort of know, what town I had visited or whatever, maybe do something about it. But at one point in time, I talked to him on the phone. He said, I'm not getting your dispatches. What's going on? I said, Dad, there's just too much bad stuff to report. I'm not going to do these anymore. Right? So the war started. And of course, all the Titos came out because they believed in this pan-Yugoslavia, this pan-ethnic idea, but Milosevic would not stand for it. Right? He was not about to allow this pan-ethnic idea to continue under his rule. He sent the army, and they started sniping at the secessionists, at the people who had just had a referendum from February 28th through March 1st. Bosnia voted to secede from Yugoslavia. And then snipers came out during the rallies, and they started shooting at people. And they blockaded the cities, Sarajevo, eastern Bosnia, most of Herzegovina. And the blockades went from sort of the borders of the country, started going inside the country, around each and every town, on each and every road. And you saw the barricades that I had to cross to get in. More sniping. They stuck up signs at cross streets saying, caution, sniper. That's what that says, pazi, sniper. Right? So there is this civilian population that's now being targeted by a professional military. And what I say to the Bosnians when I talk to them is this: do you know how that military that was shooting against you was funded? It was funded by your taxes. When Bosnia and Herzegovina was a republic in the Yugoslavia, the taxes that the Bosnians paid for the very bullets that the Yugoslav army was using against them to shoot at them. Right? Really have to start thinking about how this war unfolded. The tanks came. The Yugoslav army at the time was the fourth most powerful army in Europe, against a civilian population of about 4 million people. Mostly farmers, rural, agrarian society, some industry. but certainly not any level of sophistication to have organized self-defense, organized capabilities to go against and defend against, like, these tanks and all of this. I came up against a bunch of these people, and there was one guy a commander at a checkpoint just outside of Sarajevo in a town called Ilija, and he stopped my convoy many times. His name was Dusan. Many times he stopped the convoys, and he kept threatening me, but I kept, sort of going through. And one time he came up and he said, "I told you never to come back here." And I said, "I know, but look, this time it's different. I have, medicines that are needed very badly, and I have to get through." And he said, he swore at me, he yelled at me, and he got very, very anxious. And of course, they're all holding weapons, and I've got nothing. And I'm there with a couple of Italian guys in my car. One of the Italian friends of mine is driving. I'm sitting on the passenger side. I've got a van full of medical supplies behind me. Two Italians are driving. One of them is driving, one of them is passenger. They brought their guitar because they thought they'd make peace, with whoever was angry at them, because they were singers and so on, and young people. And he got really mad, and he said, "Look, you've crossed the line." He says, "I told you never to come back, and you did. My soldiers are going to kill you." And he said something, and he ordered a bunch of people, and I hear the Kalashnikov sort of all, unlocking their locks. And the only thing I could say to him at the time was, I said, "Dusan, why is it that your soldiers have to do the dirty work? Is it that you don't have the courage to do it yourself?" It's the only thing I could think of. It was a stupid thing to say, by the way. He took the butt end of his Kalashnikov right through the window of the car, hit me on the side of the head. I had bleeding and all that, but I survived. He got angry. I evoked emotion out of him. That was the first thing. And he turned our convoy around and sent us back. We didn't get through that time. But we came back when he wasn't on duty, probably like 2 days later, and I got my convoy through. So the point is that this professional army, highly orchestrated, highly organized, well-structured, well-funded, right? And they know what they're doing. And they shelled the parliament. They knew exactly what they were targeting. This building was known as Skupština. This was the parliament of Bosnia and Herzegovina. Right? And they decided to take it out. Again, with this, this insidious grenade. Apartments. They targeted the apartments of medical doctors, so that when they targeted everybody else in the city, the medical doctors wouldn't be around to treat them. Right? Orchestrated campaign, really, really well thought out. This is not something that just happened where somebody just decided to go on a rampage and shoot a bunch of people. I met with a doctor, his name is Adil Kalenovic, during the war, and he said, "Oh yeah, I don't have an apartment anymore." I said, "Why?" And he said, "Well, because they shelled it. Fortunately, I was out. But they knew exactly where I lived. They knew exactly what they were trying to do as they were targeting me." Right? And a very famous picture emerged, "Welcome to Hell." This was Sarajevo, right, from 1992 to 1995. More than 100,000 people killed. This is a mass gravesite in the town of Srebrenica. 8,352 Muslim boys and men over a period of 1 week were collected, separated from the women, taken out to a factory and to a field, and murdered. And then their bodies were dumped into mass graves with bulldozers and trying to cover the earth and so on. Satellite images, reconnaissance images picked up pictures of dirt being moved, and then the international community decided to go and investigate and so on. And they uncovered the two worst mass graves, Srebrenica and Tomašica in Prijedor. Both of them, about 8,000 people killed in each one. 20,000 to 26,000 girls and women were raped in concentration camps set up all across Bosnia and Herzegovina. Hundreds of thousands arrested, beaten, tortured. There's a very famous and amazing book written by Roy Gutman called A Witness to Genocide. Roy actually visited the concentration camps. He wrote about it. He was the one who broke the news story. And President Clinton was reading the newspaper at the time, and he called Anthony Lake, his national security advisor, into his office, and he said, Tony, are there concentration camps being set up in Europe today? Right? President of the United States asking National Security Advisor, are there concentration camps being set up? And 2 million people forcefully evicted from their homes. About 1 million of them completely evicted from Bosnia and Herzegovina. That's what Bosnians today call their diaspora. They're scattered. About, I don't know, a couple of 100,000 in the United States, Australia, Germany, Canada, all of the countries that took refugees. All of a sudden, it points to the value of the refugee programs that some of these nations have had over a period of time. And we need to go back and revisit what our position and thinking is about refugees. These are people who are in need for sure, but they're also people who contribute a lot to our knowledge and our awareness. So we kind of have to start thinking and rethinking our policy and our position on that. One of the things that I always think about Yugoslavia and this whole breakup and the notion of genocide, targeting an ethnic group, going after a population, starving them to death, preventing births by raping their women, massacring their men and boys in a patriarchal society is equivalent to genocide. It is the definition of genocide, right? But it took all of these roles, leaders, decision makers, influencers, all of these roles, right, to make this thing happen. It didn't just happen on its own, right? Somebody had to support them. Somebody had to finance this entire operation, right? Somebody had to cheer on all of those people. The churches had to come and bless every one of those soldiers that were about to go and commit some of these atrocities. So when you start thinking about the accountability model today, fast forward now 27 years past that, the accountability cannot just rest with those who pull the triggers. It also has to extend to those who have supported the pulling of the trigger, right? And all of those who blessed it and all of those who cheered it. And the lesson for us today, I'll be asking you about this in the Q&A. The lesson for us today is this. Are we today supporting some activities and patterns and trends that could end up in catastrophic results like we saw in Yugoslavia? And what will be our accountability? Remember, I go back to my garbage can when I was hugging it. I had purpose, and my purpose in that garbage can and that embrace that I was giving it for 20 minutes was to say, what's going to be my accountability if I survive this sniper? My accountability is going to be whether I could clarify, elucidate what I learned and what I saw in the war. Right? I wasn't a supporter or a cheerleader. I was a bystander, maybe at best. Maybe an observer, maybe some guy who just showed up, wrong place, wrong time, or whatever you want to call it. But this accountability is something that dawned on me back then, 1992, that, hey, somebody's going to hold me accountable, and I'm going to have to explain what my purpose was and how I fulfilled that. Orchestrated, I think we covered this. There's this notion of a joint criminal enterprise. This is a very interesting concept that came out of the International Criminal Tribunal. This is where criminals get together and they start creating agreements among themselves, to say that, hey, I will go and sort of raid one town and you raid the other, and then when that happens, we'll ethnically cleanse the populations. We'll divide the territory among ourselves, right? They start reaching agreement on how to divvy up the loot, the booty, or whatever it is that they're collecting from these towns to try to share in the benefit with each other. They reach agreement of sort of mutual détente. I won't attack you and you don't attack me, but we will attack those villages and rape their women and so on. Right? These agreements were made. 1992, I'm not talking about medieval time, right? I'm not talking about like feudalism when these things were started. I'm talking about like this era. When I was a young man when this was happening. So this is an affront to my humanity. And when I see it happening today in places, it's still an affront to my humanity. And I start wondering, wow, I obviously didn't do enough in my purpose that I stated to try to make people aware of what was happening. Right? Exploiting opportunities. Anytime there's rhetoric against somebody, right? The media jumps on it because it's a soundbite, and they love sound bites. And the politicians and these manipulators of masses, they know how to exploit these sound bites and do things with them, right? And then there's this extremely insensitive leadership. Brutal is really the word to put on it. Brutal. They have no compassion for human life. Right? Their goal is their goal, which is to go create a stronger nation, a better nation, to do this, to do that. Where's the compassion? And without compassion, where's humanity? I submit there is no humanity if there isn't compassion. We're animals at that point in time. Even animals have compassion, for crying out loud. I think it would be an insult to animals to say that we would be animals if we didn't have compassion. Right? There are primary activities, like I said, somebody pulling the trigger, somebody enforcing the blockade, somebody, hitting the international aid worker across the head. I mean, there are things, but then there's also this world of bystanders. So when we hear about Yemen, do we care? Do we do anything? Right? When we heard about Darfur, did we do anything? When we hear about the Rohingya, or when we hear about the Uyghurs, or Guatemala, or Cambodia, or any place for that matter, we tend to say, you know what, it's not happening in my neighborhood. I'm sort of an isolationist, and I'm okay with whatever's happening, let it happen. I don't know that that's necessarily a good position for us to take, because it's robbing us of our humanity. We happen to be betraying our own humanity by allowing these things to continue. So there's a call to activism through all of this, right? This was my call to activism. I went in as part of the United Nations mission. I signed up with an NGO, and I said, I'm going to go and do whatever I can do to help. I don't think I did anything. Perhaps it was a drop in the ocean to what I ended up doing. But at the end of the day, I can go back and think about my purpose, and I can say, I actually did fulfill my purpose. I clarified why Bosnia and Herzegovina is to be considered a genocide. Right? It was the intentional destruction of a population. It was the intentional ethnic cleansing, the prevention of birth. If you go back to the classic definition of genocide and go back to Lemkin's Convention on Genocide in the United Nations, you will find that Bosnia fits that test. Not just Srebrenica, but also Prijedor, Žepa, Doboj, a bunch of towns. Sarajevo itself, almost 16,000 people killed. In the city, the entire population, 360,000 people, blockaded, right? I ended up delivering water in places. And the international courts have obviously come back and validated a lot of this notion of genocide and tried the highest, most visible, the highest leadership, the most visible sort of criminals brought to justice to some degree. But it took them 25 years to get there. This means that the entire jurisprudence system that we've set up has failed. Right? In the United States, we have this notion of quick trial, right? That you're accused by the state of something, you get to trial fast, the decision is made fast. Some of these decisions, the prisoners died in prison while waiting for the adjudication. And why did that happen? Well, because the perpetrators of this act of genocide, Milosevic, Karadzic, and Mladic, they learned from the previous ones. Inasmuch as you are going to school and learning about these, they also went to school and learned. And they improved on the mistakes of the others. How long did the Nuremberg trials take? They didn't take 25 years. 3 months was the longest trial. Right? And yet, Karadzic's trial extended for years. Milosevic's trial, thousands and thousands of pages of documentation created because they were very smart. And so that's the next lesson for us to learn, is that not only was it orchestrated, but it was orchestrated in such a way that nobody could put the finger on the criminals. But witnesses came forward. We have a couple of them here today in our audience, members of the Bosnian community that showed up. Right? These are people who spoke up. And they went to the trials and they pointed out criminals and they said, these are the people we saw. They became witnesses. They testified. They spoke up. Right? And it's one of the calls to action for the Bosnian community today is to speak up. And for all the rest of us also to speak up when we see this. So the ethnic makeup of Bosnia was this. It was people lived everywhere. It was kind of like California. Nobody really cared where they lived. Nobody cared who was in which neighborhood. Economic distinction was probably the only form, class distinction, that existed in the country. But the war polarized. And after the war, this thing that we call the Dayton Agreement in Dayton, Ohio, President Clinton and his team of advisors brought together the 5 warring parties, believe it or not, from this war, and forced a ceasefire by threatening Milosevic with this weapon the United States has called a Tomahawk missile. From the Adriatic Sea, the Tomahawks were fired against Milosevic's strong positions, and his military infrastructure was being destroyed. And at that time, Richard Holbrooke was the ambassador to the former Yugoslavia, special envoy from President Clinton. And Holbrooke decided to call all of them to the U.S. to negotiate a peace treaty. He brought the leaders, Milosevic from Serbia, or ex-Yugoslavia, and Alija Izetbegovic, the president of Bosnia and Herzegovina, and Franjo Tuđman, the president of Croatia, to the Wright-Patterson Air Force Base in Dayton, Ohio. And he invited, he had a gala dinner after a week long of negotiations. He had a gala dinner, and he decided to have the dinner in the hangar where the B-1 stealth bomber was parked. And the way he did it, he described this in his book, the way he did it is that he picked seats for all of the attendees, and he sat Milosevic in a chair that the needle nose of the B-1 bomber would be pointing at the back of his head. Right? And with that symbolism, he reminded Milosevic what it was going to cost him if he didn't sign this peace agreement. So literally, with a gun to their heads, all of the leaders agreed to a ceasefire agreement. And that agreement, memorialized in Dayton, Ohio, became known as the Dayton Agreement. Signed in Paris towards the end of the year, but it divided Bosnia and Herzegovina into these ethnic regions. At the time, it served its purpose because it was a ceasefire agreement. But 25 years past that, that agreement continues to serve sort of as the constitutional basis of the nation. And neither Holbrooke nor Clinton nor any of the people that were involved in it ever assumed that for decades this ceasefire agreement would then become the basis on which the nation would progress. And the net result of that agreement is that criminals continue to be glorified because of sort of the ethnic purity of the regions that they've created for themselves. Imagine if at the end of the Second World War, Rudolf Hess, who was the commander of the Auschwitz concentration camp, was given control, let's say, of South Poland. Right? What would have happened then? Right? And that's kind of what Dayton did, is it gave sort of these criminals and the representative of these criminals territorial authority. And it gave them bargaining and negotiating power in the government and the system of Bosnia and Herzegovina. Bosnia and Herzegovina has 3 presidents at any given point in its time. It doesn't have 1, but 3. I have a 10-year-old son who, when he first heard that, last year we went to Bosnia and the elections were happening, and he heard the country has 3, and he said, we met with one of the presidential candidates, and he said to him, Borisha was the guy's name. He said, Borisha, can I ask you a question? You're a presidential candidate. He says, yes, I am. And he said, how do you run a country with 6 pairs of hands on the steering wheel? Right, 6 hands on the steering wheel. And Borisha looks at him and says, well, we're running a country, not driving a car. And he said, isn't it the same thing? A 10-year-old now asking a presidential candidate in Bosnia and Herzegovina, like, how do you drive a car when there are 3 people all trying to steer? How do you steer a nation in a country? And of course, Bosnia has stagnated. Right? It hasn't really gone anywhere. The political system continues to be a mess. They spend more money on their government per capita than we do, including our military budget, by the way. Right? So very high expense in a bureaucratic system that's just functionally not operative for the nation. But I wanted to share this with you. July 13th, there's a memo note taken by Alexander Vershaw and Anthony Gardner. These are advisors to President Bill Clinton. This is from the Clinton Library under the Freedom of Information Act, released documents. They're redacted, but this is a conversation, a telephone conversation between President Bill Clinton and President Jacques Chirac of France. And I want to highlight for you Jacques Chirac saying to President Clinton, "You see what we are seeing on TV, how the Serbs are separating men from women, sending women to be raped and killing men who are old enough to bear arms. In my opinion, we can no longer just stand by and watch this," and the next word is redacted. I'll let you figure out what that word is. But my opinion of it is that it's genocide. July 13th, 1995. We had identified this. I gave an interview to a college newspaper in Canada called The Charlatan in 1992, October. And in that 92, I called out that Bosnia-Herzegovina was undergoing a genocide. I got a letter from the Foreign Minister of Canada on the heels of that interview. His name was Andre Ouellet. And he said to me that I was being irresponsible in my claim. And that I should work with the committee that he was heading, which was called the Foreign Affairs Council, and that the Foreign Affairs Council did not see this as genocide. That was in 1992. I wasn't really that smart of a guy. I was just a guy who happened to have just showed up in the place and was perhaps more observant than others. But I was determined to call it the way I saw it. And of course, in 1995. And so what happened that week? July 11th through July 15th, 1995, 8,000 boys and men in the town of Srebrenica were separated, exactly as President Chirac had said, and they were massacred, they were killed, gunpoint, knife, whatever it was that they could do. Their bodies were bulldozed into ditches, covered with mass graves. To this day, 25 years, what is it now, later, 24 years later, they're still exhuming bodies. Mothers are waiting to find remains of their children. They still don't know where they are. The youngest being 3 months old, the oldest being 73 or 78, something like that. It was horrific. It was absolutely horrific. I want to tell you this. One of the things that I did when I was in Bosnia-Herzegovina, I finally found a picture of a house. There were two houses. I don't have a picture of the other house next to it. In central Bosnia, there was this strip, this road that you had to drive down in order to get past these warring factions. The Croats in 1993 and the Muslims had sort of also cooked it up. They had a mini war going on among themselves. And this house belonged to the Croat commander of a checkpoint. And about 1.6 kilometers away was the next checkpoint of a Muslim commander. But the Muslim commander had his house just on the other side, off the edge of this frame. And they were neighbors. And here they were in 1993 in March when I crossed this road to go from the Croat side to the Muslim side with the convoy of supplies, because the Muslim side had been under siege for like 45 days or 60 days or something. I came to this commander and he said to me, "Where are you going?" And I said, "I'm going to the other side." And he said, "Don't go there." And I said, "Why?" "I'm delivering humanitarian aid." He said, "They'll kill you before you get there." And I said, "How do you know that?" And he said, "Well, I know because they're shooting at us." And I said, "Look, I've got a little white flag thing, and I'll take my chances. I'm not so worried about them shooting at me. When I get there, I'll let them know who I am. I'm not a combatant. I don't have weapons." And he said, "Listen, don't. This is not. You're taking your life into your own hands." And I said, "It's okay." So I went. He let me go after some negotiation. I bribed him or something like that. Gave him some, a few liters of cooking oil and some flour and yeast. Actually, the thing that got me to go was a packet of yeast that I gave him, because these kinds of things you don't find during war. And he let me go. I got to the other side. I delivered my supplies. Then coming back, the commander of the other side, the Muslim side, said, "Look, don't go over there. They're going to kill you." I said, "Listen, I've heard this thing before. They told me exactly that when I was coming in." He said, No, this is really, now they'll kill you because, this is, there's some heightened state of fighting going on between us. And I said, let me take my chances. And I negotiated and I got myself out of that checkpoint. And then I stopped. I got 50 meters from the checkpoint. And I came back and I said, "Listen, I'm just curious. Do you guys know each other?" And he said, "Yeah, actually we do." And I said, because it sounds to me like you have familiarity. When he was talking about you, it seemed to me that he had, and this guy said, yeah, you know, we were neighbors before the war. And I said, okay. And I got in my car and took our little van and we left. And I got to the other side and I asked the commander the same thing. And he says, oh, is that guy Mustafa? I said, yeah, it was. I didn't know his name. I just, and he said, yeah, he was my neighbor. And he says, hey, do me a favor. Give him a pack of cigarettes. Would you mind driving back? Right? I mean, two people that are looking at each other in the crosshairs of their Kalashnikovs, and one of them says, you know what, give him a pack of cigarettes. So I said, sure. So I took the pack of cigarettes and I started driving. I said, you know what? Why don't you come with me? I said, what's your name? He said, Goran. I said, Goran, why don't you come with me? And you give them the pack of cigarettes. No, they'll kill me before I get there. I said, look, you know what? Come with me. I know I've heard this whole thing of killing and so on, but, you know, let's go halfway and see what happens. So I get him halfway. I get to this Mustafa. I say, hey, your buddy Goran wants to see you. What does he want to do? He want to kill me? I said, no, he's got a pack of cigarettes. So why didn't he give it to you? I said, I wouldn't take it. I don't support people who smoke. And so he said, okay, so he gets in my car and I bring these two right, like just literally in the middle of this no man's land. And Goran gives him the cigarettes. He lights one up. Goran lights one up, gives him the pack. And I'll tell you, I just watched these two guys smoke. I never thought smoking was a good thing. But for the duration that they were smoking, they weren't shooting at each other. They weren't looking at each other through the hostile crosshairs of their Kalashnikovs. Right? It was a very interesting observation for me to say, wow, the peace in this street, in this particular checkpoints, lasted about the duration of a cigarette smoke. Right? And then when they finished smoking, they went the other ways, and then they again locked in their Kalashnikovs and they started looking at each other. This is like absurd. Right? This is not something that you would think is happening in these military campaigns, and yet this is what happened. Neighbors, and then these two guys, I forgot to say, and these two guys, while we were standing in the middle of this no man's land, Mustafa points me to a derelict building. It's now broken over here, right? It's this whole thing. He points me to this beaten up building, and he says, you see that building? I said, yeah. He says, we built it together. I said, what do you mean you built it together? And then Goran says, yeah, you still owe me money on it. And he says, yeah, but you shelled it. Right? Now they're arguing about, they built a barn together, by the way, so they could keep their animals in it. And now they're looking at each other. That is what set the stage for me to understand what was going on in Yugoslavia. Somebody had fomented this hatred among these people. And it wasn't something that happened instantaneously. It happened over a period of time. Generations would foment hatred. Parents would teach their children to hate others. It's not something you really think about. Like, I don't think any of your parents said to you, oh, go and hate so-and-so, right? But the rhetoric that they used, the way that they described people, the language, the narratives, the media, the characterization of people, these are all the things that led to this massive movement of people against each other. To the point that they were willing to kill, to the point that they wanted to see one of the groups wiped off the face of the earth. Biological extinction of one of the precious human races that we have on the planet. And that's a really, really sad state to allow anybody to get to. Okay? That is the basis of exploitation. Right? This is how these things work. Massive exploitation, curtailing of basic rights. This is where it starts. We start to think about what are the rights that we have in the United States. When the Patriot Act was passed, do you remember that in the time of George Bush? We started wondering, and then the son of Patriot, Patriot 2 was Act, where the government extends its rights and starts doing more things, perhaps infringing on our rights. Right? Freedom is freedom for as long as it doesn't infringe on somebody else's freedom. And when it does, then it's no longer freedom, because for one person it becomes a restraint or a constraint of some kind, and for another it becomes an exploitative opportunity, an opportunity to exploit. Threatening rhetoric. We start seeing this from politicians. You have to be scared when that happens. Vote those people out of office, by the way, if they do any of these things. Right? They don't deserve to be your leaders or our leaders. They just don't. We know the history has shown us catastrophic results come from these kinds of rhetorical statements that are made against people. The minute you start identifying a group of one or another and start labeling, okay? War as a backdrop. This is a really interesting concept. The question that I often ask and am asked is this one: what's the difference between war and genocide? I want you to really think about that. Right? War serves as probably the best backdrop. If you had to camouflage genocide, you would probably camouflage it under the disguise of a war. If you just go and kill a bunch of people and identify them and say, okay, I'm going to go kill, like people say, well, you're killing a bunch of people. But when war is happening, this murky thing comes up where you don't know who's who in the zoo. All of a sudden you're like, oh, well, there's, they have this 1,000-year-old history of fighting against each other from the time of the Ottomans and da-da-da-da-da, and you excuse that behavior. In the meanwhile, populations are being ethnically cleansed and raped and so on, right? Eviction and transfer, right? Moving people out of their homes, out of their ancestral homelands. How many times have we seen that in genocide? And destruction of life is confused with collateral damage, right? At that point in time, 1,600 children killed in Sarajevo. I was there on one winter, November, I think it was, 1992. Grenades fell in this neighborhood called Ali Pasha Polje. It was one of those apartment buildings, communist era, 11 stories or something like that. Kids went out to do sledding, tobogganing, and then shells fell and boom, kids are dead. Somebody said, well, that was collateral damage. I said, what do you mean collateral damage? How is that even possible? Children are dead. Well, the shell was never really intended. I said, it wasn't one shell. There were 3 shells. They were all lobbed, and 2 of them came from one place, and the other one came from another direction. This means that was targeted. It was orchestrated. Somebody knew exactly what they were doing. They wanted to terrorize. They wanted to horrify people, right? Leadership ruling with an iron fist. Deceiving, cheating, lying, agreeing to things, and then reneging on the agreements. All of these are patterns that we see happening over and over again. Okay, I want to be mindful of the time. We're at about 5:20, and I want to get to my conclusion, and then we're going to talk about the rest of it as part of the Q&A. Okay, what's next? When populations get displaced, we tend, as an international community, to not want to do anything about them because the problems are too great. All of these people don't have documents. We don't even know who they are. What are you going to do with them? They left their homes in wheelbarrows, for crying out. Whatever they could do, they got out with whatever they could carry in their hands. My wife was undocumented. She didn't have a single stitch of evidence to identify herself. I don't know if she is who she says she is. I only trust her because she says so. And when we went to get married, believe me, it was hell. I had no way of proving that she was who she was. We ended up sort of making up her social security number. We didn't make a new one up. In Yugoslavia, they actually had a pattern that they followed, and based on that, we were sort of able to recreate it. Her grandmother was, I don't know, she was at the time, she was born in 1932, so she was 60 years old. And she didn't she didn't know anything. She couldn't read or write. And she didn't know her birth date even. So no documents. So when we inquired as to when she was born, she said, well, I remember there was no salt during that war, and so on and so forth. And as it turned out, she said, listen, my birthday only happens once every 4 years. I know what her birth date is. When she said it only happens every 4 years, I know it's a February 29th, and now I can go back to approximately, it's either 1932, or it's 1928, or it's 1936. She was too old because she remembered the start of the Second World War. She was old enough, that means it had to be 1932, right? So imagine the problems that these people are coming with, just the logistical problems of trying to do something about them. So we need to have some sort of a mechanism. We know from the Second World War, these names stand out: Eichmann, Hitler, Goebbels. I mean, the names are notorious. Sadly, from this war, names stand out: Milosevic, Karadzic, Mladic, the military general, and their civilian masters, right? I don't know how to describe the repetition of history other than to say if you sit down and you compare, you'll start seeing the patterns as being largely the same. This is Radovan Karadzic in the International Criminal Tribunal. He was tried and convicted for the first time for 45 years, and then after that, life imprisonment during the appeals. And this man is this guy from this concentration camp that you see over here. His name is Fikret Alic. He actually testified in The Hague. He survived, he came back, he testified against Karadzic, and was one of the key witnesses. So it takes a tremendous amount of courage to do that. I want to close by showing you these. These are chairs that were set up in the city of Sarajevo as a memorial, as a remembrance to the siege of the city. And when you think of this, it's just red plastic chairs, but when you think of it lining the city streets, it's actually quite representative of what happened. When they say that a picture speaks 1,000 words, this one speaks 11,541, one for each person that was killed that's no longer living in that city. And that is the story of the Bosnian War and the Bosnian Genocide.